Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. Tonight we are here with Dianne Dotson to celebrate her latest book, The Shadow Galaxy, a collection of short stories and poetry. This evening we have a special guest host who will be conducting the interview, Miss Robin Rose Graves from the YouTube channel, The Bookworm Hole. I'm going to hand it over to Robin. Enjoy, everybody.
Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to Space Cowboy Books Online. As Jean-Paul said, I am your guest host, Robin Rose Graves, and I'm here with Dianne Dotson. Dianne Dotson is the author of the space opera series, The Questreson Saga, and her short fiction has been featured in Interzone magazine and Solarpunk magazine. Her latest book, The Shadow Galaxy, is a collection of short stories and poetry. And she has another book coming out later this year from Android Press called The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern. Dianne is a member of the Science Fiction Writers Association, the Horrors Writers Association, the British Fantasy Society, and the British Science Fiction Association. You can learn more about Dianne and her books at the links listed in the chat. All right, and now without further ado, Dianne will read an excerpt from The Shadow Galaxy. And then we'll get into some questions. If anyone in the audience has something they would like to ask Dianne, please leave a question in the chat. And now on to you, Dianne.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. I would like to read from a story that is partially based on my father and my journeys to a certain mountain in East Tennessee. My father passed away in 2020, so I am trying to remember him in stories, and my mother recently passed away as well. So the fingerprint of my parents' backgrounds as storytellers and part of publishing are definitely throughout all my works and will be forever. That's how I will keep them alive, partly. So without further ado, The Queen and the Mountain Laurel. Laurel was given her name by her papa. She was a pale infant, and when her mother and father were arguing what to name her, Papa stepped in. "She looks like a mountain laurel blossom," said Papa, squinting his rheumy eyes at her, and so Laurel was named. She would go with her father on excursions to one of the mountains in Tennessee to find scraggly, forgettable plants and bring them home to fill out their wooded yard. It had been a year, and now the time had come. The frost had ended in the valleys, but the mountains might still harbor pockets of ice. She thought they were little secret snow villages where the ice fairies dwelt. Laurel bumped in her seat in the old Ford Bronco. Her dad drew on his cigarette and swung his arms to and fro, steering over the ruts in the road up Mullins Mountain. He flicked the ashes out the rolled-down window. They traveled this way a few miles. It exhausted Laurel, but they had bologna sandwiches, an RC cola, and some chips. She was just about ready for those. Finally, they pulled into a familiar area where the road tumbled uncertainly through young spring weeds, past a fire tower. She could feel the chill of the shade the minute she got out of the truck. Her dad handed her a burlap bag, and he grabbed a spade from the back. The wind whipped up and around them, and she shivered. They walked toward the forest where hemlocks whirred and hissed. Her dad knew where to go. The year before, they had followed the path of a large creek that spilled from the springs near the mountain's peak. She slipped and slid among the rocks of the creek as she hopped across them, while her father made his way along the bank. The mountain laurel looked at first glance like wildly misplaced mangroves, flung into the air from warmer climes. Their dark oblong leaves looked like the bay leaves her mother would add to bean soup. In a couple of months, the mountain laurel would bloom into creamy, blush-tinted pom-poms. Less refined than showy rhododendrons and leggier than azaleas, mountain laurels were the unsung fair ladies of the southern Appalachian forest. Laurel heard a ka-chuck as her dad plunged a shovel into the earth. A voice whispered to her, "Don't let him." Laurel jumped from her seat on a cold stone and skidded nearly into the creek. She looked around. The sun shone through the evergreens in a long silver shaft. She could see the form of a tall woman standing next to her, diaphanous, as if made of the sunbeam itself. Who are you?" Laurel asked in a hushed tone. The light lady said, "I am the mountain queen. The mountain laurels are my ladies in waiting." Laurel, never a subtle child, said, I thought they were just plants. The Mountain Queen dipped her head, which sparkled like a dappling of late afternoon sun on the surface of quick water. No, child, they are like you, but they move more slowly, said the Mountain Queen. And Laurel gazed over at the plants and gasped. The tall shrubs bowed to the Queen. Please let them be, pleaded the Mountain Queen. Tell your father. He won't believe me, said Laurel. He says I tell too many stories. Try, begged the Queen. Laurel sighed, nodded, and clambered up the bank of the stream. Her father was struggling with his digging. Daddy, she called to him, noticing his sweat. Don't take them this time, Daddy. What? He asked, staring at her. We drove all this way. I know, Daddy, said Laurel, and she glanced over her shoulder and could see the Queen swaying in the weak forest light. It's not right, Daddy. We have enough of them at home. Please, Daddy, let's just eat and hike and go home. Please? Her father shoved his sun hat up his high forehead and stared down at her brown eyes from his hazel ones. Laurel felt nervous. They had come a long way after all. Well, Laurel, he said to her, if you feel that way, I guess we have all the laurels we need at home because we've got you. Thank you, Daddy, said Laurel, smiling. She looked back at the creek and could see the flickering Mountain Queen curtsy, and then the Queen vanished, leaving only her ladies in waiting bowing before them. The end. And next, to switch things up, I'm going to read something based on a real place. This is dipping back into Appalachia, but we're dipping into horror now. This is a quick one, but a harsh one. It's based on a real place in my hometown in East Tennessee, a tunnel, a very strange tunnel with a sad and horrible legacy. The tunnel at the end. It stretched in a black arc, a toothless maw into which the road crumbled. They said you can hear the screaming inside the tunnel, whispered Nate. Sarah snickered. It's just a tunnel. Just drive. Let's get this over with. I have a test tomorrow. Vic sat at the wheel. The old Mustang sputtered. It had been his grandfather's. They've been saying things about this place for years, he said in a grunt. Don't you think by now we know if it was true? Nate shook his head. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, he said, his hands gripping the back of the passenger seat. Hey, cried Sarah, and the two boys jumped. Let go of my hair. Nate muttered an apology and sat, shaking. Sarah, now powerfully annoyed, said testily, would you just go? She thumbed her phone. The reception is bad here. I really need to get back. Either back up and turn around or gun it. It's a short tunnel. How can you tell? Asked Nate. The inky archway showed no light, no depth. It was just black. Because I've been here in the day, Sarah snapped, exasperated. She swung her long, straight mahogany hair over her shoulder. So you've been through it? Nate asked. No, Sarah admitted. We were in too wide a car. Had to turn around. It's an old tunnel. Why, I don't know if this thing is going to fit, Vic said, his hands rubbing the bumpy steering wheel. If I scrape the paint, Dad'll kill me. Sarah clucked her tongue. Nate cleared his throat. Turn around then, he said. Nah, Vic said, his eyes looking straight ahead. I think it'll make it. Sarah crossed her arms and looked back at Nate. We're going, she said, as if that was the final authority. Nate covered his eyes. The Mustang growled back to life, and Vic eased it forward. Go faster, said Sarah, and in the dim light of her phone, Nate could see her throat bob from swallowing. Can't, said Vic, having a hard time getting it to go at all. Nate gripped the seat again, careful not to catch Sarah's hair. Then stop, back up. Vic put his foot on the brake. It's not stopping, he said, but he pumped the brakes. They rolled forward, ever forward, to the black expanse of the tunnel. Sarah cried, why can't you stop? I don't know, yelled Vic. I'm getting out, said Sarah, and she tried opening the door. It would not open. She tried opening the window. It didn't roll down. We're going in, Vic cried out. Nate breathed harder and faster, pulling at the door handle. Then he leaned back and pushed with his feet and kicked the glass. All light vanished. My phone, said Sarah softly. It's dead. We're in, said Vic, his voice flat. No light could be found anywhere. They could not see each other. Only the sound of their breathing proved that they were together at all. Then they heard it, a quiet echo at first, It rose in pitch and met them at last. A scream. The scream. Nate felt tears stream down his face, for he had no control then of his body, and there was no escape. He heard Sarah breathing quickly, whimpering. Vic was silent except for an occasional slam of his feet on the gas, which did nothing. The car engine then stopped. Let's get back out and run, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Can't get the doors open, said Nate. Vic repeated, his foot pumping on both the gas and the brakes while trying to turn the car on. Nothing. The scream continued to rise in pitch. Nate reached his hands forward to try and touch Vic or Sarah, and he felt nothing. The car began to vibrate. The scream grew louder. What's happening? Sarah yelled. Then the car lurched, and Nate could feel himself sliding. We're falling, Sarah screamed. The car was falling in empty blackness, falling, falling. Then all three of them screamed and screamed. The scream. The end. So those are two very different stories, very different flavors, and that is pretty much how the Shadow Galaxy is arranged. In different sections, different stories, and some poetry at the back.
Thank you for that wonderful read, and I loved hearing it in your voice too. You really brought life to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say this collection definitely shows your broad range as an author, with stories that range from fantasy to science fiction and to horror. And I think a lot of them also blend genres too, a little bit of, you know, multiple genres in one. So my first question for you is, what are the different challenges of writing fantasy versus science fiction, and what are the advantages of both genres?
I don't know that either one is more challenging than the other, because, you know, as you have said, I do blend them, and I've blended them in the Questrazon Saga quite a bit. And that's just something I've always done because I love fantasy, science fiction, and horror pretty much equally. And I like to interweave them whenever I can. And so I would say that the challenges might arise from a different type of world building, but it's just another flavor, right? You know, so in fantasy, you have your dragons and your, you know, magical realms, and you have magic in the place of technology, for example, or something like that. It tends to be not in space, but you can have space fantasy, which I write some of. Science fiction tends to be more obviously science related, but not necessarily hard science. You know, you can have wormholes that we can't quite prove exist, but that take you across the galaxy somewhere else, you know, things like that. And in terms of, you know, the benefits of both, fantasy allows you to kind of step back from any reality that you would ever live in, either in the distant past or future. Science fiction presents a reality that is possible, even if it's not plausible yet. So there's a difference between sort of that time relationship, for example.
And then I also want to ask about, how does fantasy and science fiction intersect with horror? And I think a lot of your stories in this collection have a lot of intersection with that.
I think that with horror, you find that you are disturbed on a level that either relates to your lack of control or the character's lack of agency, or perhaps flipping it, indicating a power control grab by a villain or monster, you know. And so you can lace that into fantasy and science fiction. You can have a monstrous dragon, like say Sleeping Beauty, the Disney movie, for example, was a great, you know, Maleficent becoming this horrible, horrific dragon. That's an element of horror there, you know, and it's pretty stressful. But and then two, in science fiction and horror, that's an easy one. You look at The Thing, Alien, you know, Event Horizon is a perfect example, you know, cosmic horror situation. And I just think that it's just hugely entertaining for me. And so it's, for me, it's easy because I can imagine scenarios which I would not want to be in. And the horror is very much that, right? You don't want to be in these awful scenarios in which you have no control, in which you are a victim or potential victim, for example.
Yeah, I love that first thing that you said about like losing power and like losing control. And I definitely see that theme cropping up a lot in your stories. And also think like on the other hand, there's a lot of stories about like grasping power, you know, and you know, grabbing control again. We got a question from the chat. Will some of these short stories continue to something longer? And this is from Richard. Any plans on extending some of the worlds that you created in your short stories for this collection?
Well, it's confirmed that one of them is definitely my current work in progress, is related to the scaffold, the short story in this collection. And it ends abruptly for a reason. And there is a reason that I do end some of these stories abruptly, which we can talk about later. And so in this occasion, the book that I'm currently writing, which is near future, in other words, sort of current, but kind of in the future, sci-fi mystery thriller. There's a disturbing thing that happens in our world with real world people, you know, that opens up the possibility of very bad future situation, you know. So it begins from a place of grief on the main character's part, which the character in this book, Gail, is not the main character of the novel I'm writing. So, but she does play an important role, and I won't say what that is. So that's happening. Now, my agent and I, and publisher as well, are keeping track of everyone's favorites in the book. And I'm hearing a lot of a few of them in particular keep coming up. Void Mage is one of them. One Evening in Fogvale is another. The Glove and the Black Lantern and Rotor. Those four seem to be, in addition to the Scaffold, which people seem to enjoy, those are the ones that seem to capture a lot of attention. But what I could do is, there is a way in which some of these could be actually connected together with a cosmic horror threat, both in the past and in space. So when you have The Glove and the Black Lantern and Stolen Art, there's an undercurrent of this thing in the past, but also might exist in the same realm as One Evening in Fogvale, so that you would have two very different factions kind of controlling the situation. You can decide which ones, I mean, it's obvious which ones are bad, but are the good ones really good? You know, so there's a lot of gray area there that I could play with. But also Topaz Sundered and Galleon's Wake are cosmic horror stories that are in space. Maybe they also occur in realms where Void Mage exists, or where, you know, Overdue in deep space could come across something pretty creepy out there. The library's cool, but aside from that, what else is out there? So a lot of these could interweave, and it could be the same presence, you know. So we're looking at, you know, how well are people responding to this, and if there's enough demand for it, then I think that we have something to go on with several of these stories to build out new universes. That's all I can really say about it, because we don't have anything set in stone, but that is it.
That's really exciting, though, to hear that your next, or one of your next projects, is going to be expanding upon one of the stories. And yeah, I felt like reading a lot of these, I was like, oh, this is such a cool world you started. I'm sad that the story's over, you know? So
I'd rather leave you wanting more than wanting less.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you heard right from Dianne that if you guys are interested in any of the stories, make yourself vocal about it, because you might get more from it. So
right,
that's why I'm, you know, put it in your reviews when you read the book.
They're very fun to write. And, you know, I think too that also even Valentine's from the Pit could be an example of another being in our world that could exist in other places as well. Sorry for the noise. Anyway.
No worries at all. Yeah, I didn't read this collection thinking that they were all the same universe, but I can see how you do read that and then assume that they're all the same universe. And that's a cool interpretation of it too. So we got another question from the chat from Amy. Do you have a favorite character within this collection of short stories, or a character that maybe surprised you in a nice way?
In a nice way. Well, that's a good one. Well, Lord Vatanite, I think, is surprising in a nice way. He's just such an ancient being, and, you know, has not really practiced delight. And here he has an opportunity to do that, and it changes him and helps him evolve in a way he didn't see coming. I kind of like that. I like characters who seem very rigid and very set in their ways, but then something or someone comes along and they open up to being a person they didn't realize they were the whole time. You know, it's a familiar trope that I love to go back to, and love that a lot. I have a lot of favorite characters. You know, Oh gosh, I don't even know where to start with that because there's so many of, I mean, I love them all in different ways, you know, even the ones who are terribly flawed, you know, and things like that. And kind of like the pirate Longshanks. He's a sort of a tragic figure. And I love ghost pirates. I mean, how could you not, right? So, you know, Void Mage, I would have a lot of fun writing him. I love Rotor. I'm very fond of, you know, his pure spirit, you know, and those kinds of things. So yeah, I have a lot of favorites, you know, it's hard to, it's like, can't pick one. I like the robots too, you know, it's like not just Rotor, but the other bots, you know, come in, go, you know, so even poor Julian, you know, we're kind of feeling him like he's so out of his element. He thinks he's got things under control and he really doesn't, right? So
Yeah, I liked your different take that you did on ghost pirates in your story in the first section of the book. I've never seen that sort of take on ghost pirates, but I'm not going to say any more about it, so people should actually read it because it is very good. Sorry. Along with genre, tone varies from story to story. Some stories are cozy and positive, and others I hope I never find myself in the protagonist's shoes.
exactly.
Yeah. What are the perks of writing good or happy endings versus bad endings, you know, where things don't end so well for the main characters and vice versa?
Well, the perks of writing the positive ending, you know, where either the hero gets something great or they come away changed in a positive way. You know, I like that because I feel like we don't celebrate happy stories enough, particularly in speculative fiction. You know, the fairy tale ending is not always a happy ending. You know, if you read the classic fairy tales, some of them are quite dark, quite disturbing, and some of them end very abruptly in a quite scary manner. So I kind of draw on both of those, the fairy tale ending that is considered the happy ending, or a neutral ending, or a new beginning. In some ways, that's what's happening with a lot of these stories, is a new beginning for a main character or a side character, you know. So that's an advantage to that I think needs to be celebrated more. And I actually am writing a collection of cozy fantasy that I'm just on the peripheral of the other things that I have due, because I have some contracts to fulfill before I can pad that out. But I do have some stories that are, you know, animal based. I have a short story in an anthology called Winter of Wonder Fauna from 2022. It's from Cloaked Press. And that short story is set in the far north. And it's a Yuletide winter solstice story of a tomten or a nissa, you know, one of the little winter spirits of the north, with a special Yule stag, you know, mystical winter solstice coziness and talking animals. So, and that is called In the Wood of Frost and Shadow. Again, it's in the Winter of Wonder Fauna anthology by Cloaked Press. So I love writing whimsical stories too. It's not all shadows, you know, so there's more coming from me that is whimsical and fun. And in addition to that, so the challenge, so writing a bad ending or a bad fate, or, you know, a terrible fate, you know, I think that it makes us appreciate that we can be safe. It makes us appreciate what we have. It's also a very cautionary tale about how much to invest in something that maybe isn't worth the risk, you know. So for example, in Topaz Sunder, was that worth the risk? No. You know. So Galleon's Wake is another example of, you know, that loss of control. Both of those stories powerfully tell that, you know. So I like those as cautionary tales that remind us that if we are in control of our surroundings, that we have power, you know, and that we shouldn't give our power away.
Particularly with your horror fiction, how and when do you decide to use implication over exposition? And also, how have you used this technique in your fantasy and science fiction as well?
Implication. Well, so that's implying that something happened, you know. The tunnel at the end is obvious that something pretty bad happened. There's no escape from that, and stolen art, you're left with some questions, but it doesn't sound good. The Glove and the Black Lantern, super not great, what's happened there. So you don't want to be in that position. And I like to both spell it out in some of them, like that one, for example, but leaving it open for what happens next, like hard landing and a hard landing. And well, honestly, Galleon's Wake is another example, because even though that one's, it's in the science fiction section, it's definitely horror, threaded with horror. But there's an open-ended question of like, did she escape? Can anybody escape? And that's another theme that's kind of running through. Can you escape from a terrible situation? And what happens if you can't? And then in the terms of Autumn's Dusk, somebody didn't escape from a fate, but that's a very different story coming from, it's a discovery of something bad that happened. So I don't know. I like it when things are left a little bit with a question mark, because that's scary. We like certainty. We like things we can count on. And I like to slam a door on some of these stories. So you don't know what happens next. You could go either way. You could maybe spin out your own fantasy, like, oh, maybe they're okay, but probably they're not, So, and the reason I write things that way is because Ray Bradbury, I'm blaming him, because that's the way he wrote a lot of stories, and so some of those got continued into books like Dandelion Wine. But, that strangler at the end of the short story, set in his Greentown, you think that woman's dead and gone, it's implied that she's been killed or something, but was she, so that's kind of where I'm drawing that sort of like, I found it quite disturbing, to be left with such an unfixed ending. And I liked that. And I wanted to celebrate that with some of these stories. It just make you feel like you've been yanked off your feet. Oops. Well, so much for that. But having a nice crystallized ending, like Roeder, for example, it's just, it's very satisfying, right? You just like, oh, or a new beginning, in the terms of Void Mage and having this possibility that you never had before. You're like, oh my God, there's a whole new universe. This is going to be great, right? So I love playing with all of those and bringing out emotion, surprise, it may not always be what you wanted, but it will definitely resonate with you and you'll feel something.
Yeah, I guess like by almost not saying, oh, this character is killed at the end, you kind of leave readers with a slight hope that maybe something happens, that they escape, but probably not, which that's actually really cool.
Yeah, like sorry, don't get a happy ending there.
So a recurring theme, and I think you kind of touched on this earlier, is otherworldly beings. And they're never quite completely defined as to what they are.
Right.
So what do you find are the advantages and disadvantages of not relying on like common monsters that are immediately recognizable, like, demons and giant lizards and stuff?
I like to create. I like to have my own flavors and my own monsters. Not in this book, but there is a cosmic horror short story, Night on Preston's Bald, which could also exist in the realm of the cosmic horror universe I'm building here. So that monster on that mountain is wildly terrifying, what happens there. And you see only a hint of what it is. And the same thing is true with the Glove and the Black Lantern. There is a monster under those streets, creeping up those lanterns, stalking, hunting. For what reason? You don't know. That's also terrifying. And I like to have monsters that are not completely defined or familiar, because that's pretty scary. But also on the flip side, having heroes or neutral characters that are mystical beings, like Void Mage or Tivoxan, or Lord Vatanite, these are different beings that are from my brain, that maybe draw on dreams that I've dreamed, or maybe just all the fairy tales and fantasies I've steeped myself in my whole life. And there are many. So I feel like what's fun about that is that it opens up this whole new universe for people to populate in their imaginations of these beings they didn't know were there. It's like, but, you know, I've brought them forward wherever they came from. You know, I've brought them to the page so that everybody can say, wow, look at that, you know, that's kind of cool. Or absolutely, I don't want to be near this thing. I don't want to be near Dr. Danube, you know. No experiments, please. So.
And then with the exception of one story, all the protagonists in this book are women. Besides the obvious answer that you are a woman writer, why do you prefer to write women protagonists?
Well, I would say in terms of that, I think if you had to pick a main character for the tunnel at the end, it would be Nate. So both Nate and Julian are male characters, and also my first novel, Heliopause in the Questions Saga, is basically from the point of view of a male character, you know, for most of the book. So I'm used to writing across different, and also the rest of the Questions Saga, while strongly Galadea based, I go into different points of view for both human males and alien males alike, among other species that are not defined as gendered, you know, like the Neuronids are completely non-gendered, strange beings. So I love playing between all of those because I feel like it's great fun. In terms of how it played out, that there were a lot more women main characters in this, that's just kind of how it fell out. It wasn't exactly intended. It's what the story demanded. It's what the characters demanded that I put down on the page for them. So, you know, sort of channeling that, well, that's what, you know, this is who they were. I'm just telling you guys what I heard on the street. So imbuing, you know, these stories with people. So
I forgot that like the one that you just read honestly does have more male protagonists, but I also was curious, Stolen Art was like one of the other few stories where the protagonist is a male character.
Yeah.
Any reason why you decided to write that one from a male perspective? Although I think it's going to be pretty similar to what you said about the female.
Well, they show up and I write them, you know, like Julian just shows up one day and full whole cloth. I'm like, what are you doing, man? Okay, I'm going to follow what you're doing and write it down. You know, that's just how it happened. Same with Forster. Actually, Forster and Ariad in the Questions Saga, I dreamed both of them at different times in my life. Ariad, I dreamed when I was like 13, and that's when I actually first started to write him. But Forster just comes to me one day, full cloth in a dream, walking down that squishy floored hallway on Mandera Research Station, rolling his eyes, disgusted in his 40-year-old, you know, disappointed life. And so they're there. I don't know. It's wherever these stories come from in my mind, you know, that they're just there, and I just follow them and see what happens next. But I will say, in terms of, since there are a lot of women protagonists or girls, because it ranges from young girls to older women, it is nice to have more women characters in science fiction. I like to see the protagonists there. I grew up with Ellen Ripley, Leia Organa, you know, Sarah Connor, you know, so, and then all the Scream Queens over time. So I strongly believe in strong women characters, and I'd like to see more in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And I'm writing all those, so you will see more.
Yeah, there's also quite a diversity of like personalities across these female characters and ages too, as you mentioned. So that's what I was kind of curious about. Like, were you just trying to, you know, say these are all the types of women that exist and are unrepresented in, you know, science fiction and fantasy? Because yeah, I think it's great to, you know, give voices to the underrepresented women.
Right, and you know, and then there's a non-binary characters like Katie mentioned in, you know, the library story overdue in deep space, the space library. Space libraries are cool. Anyway, yeah, it's like Katie is non-gendered, so non-binary. So, you know, it's like, and you don't even know it's like Katie human, you know, so so I like to play with that too. And, you know, Ariadne's strength in the Questers on Saga is to his ability to change as well. I'm not going to spoil exactly how, but, you know, he has powerful abilities. He is a galactic mage and he can shift between form and person. So I love writing things like that. You know, Tivoxan is also non-binary. We don't know, is Tivoxan human-based? Seems like not. Maybe elven? We don't know. So yeah, I like too to have different ages, because I feel like, and I did this in the Questers on Saga too with Meredith and some older women, you know, Meredith was a, you know, grandmother. So, you know, basically I like to make sure that we've got the bases covered with older characters, silver characters, golden characters, you know, and young kids too. It's our life, it's our people, you know, let's bring them all in. Big tent.
Yeah, and I think you kind of lately played with gender too, with the character of Todor. Is that the name of the road?
Rotor.
Yeah, Rotor. Oh
Yeah.
my god, yeah, I should have wrote it down. The robot character
Right.
from the title of the story with the same title.
Rotor, yeah.
When she first meets him, she kind of assumes that he's a male because of his voice, but there's this little like dialogue banter between the two of them,
Right.
where he's like, well, I don't really have a gender, so what do you think I am?
Right.
Yeah.
And she's like, what do you want?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so, you know, he makes a choice, could have made the other choice, could have made any choice, could have made non-binary choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that is a moment in which he's expressing agency.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then how did your childhood growing up in Tennessee influence or inspire the stories in Tales from the Ancient Mountains? One of the stories you read for us today was from that section of the book. But I'm also curious about like the ways your childhood had also inspired some of the other stories too.
When I was about 5 years old, my parents moved me and my siblings out to the country in a place called Gray, as in the color gray. And it was like not super close to the big towns, right? Where like I was born, which was not a big town, by the way, not super big. So that my siblings were much older than I was, and they were starting to empty nest. And here I was, basically, it felt like I was an only child, and I was growing up in this idyllic, beautiful place in the country. And I basically, that became my entire universe, and I became immersed in that place. Its legends, as I could glean them, what they were, like Mr. Gerald, who lived across, I changed the name, but this was the neighbor across the road from me, you know, that I was, my neighbor and I were terrified of, you know, so that's pretty much how it all played out. That's what happened in that story. So, but I was always a little spooked out because it was the country and there was a lot of uncertainty, you know, there was a lot of shadows, there were vines to be cleared, and under the vines I would find animal skeletons, and I would imagine all these different scenarios, and I would be out there alone for the most part until I did have a neighbor close to my age, and then we just went nuts. We invented whole realms, we invented portals to go through and ride our bikes through, and you know, it was, you watch things like Stranger Things and I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much exactly what my childhood was like. I didn't have D&D until I was a teenager, but I was inventing all these stories in real time and roping my childhood friends in with me, scaring the dickens out of some of them, getting them pretty involved in others. And I had an astronomy club that I formed and would make little stories as part of the newsletter. And some of those I have drawn upon for upcoming stuff, like picking some of the names out. So I've got a lot of old writings going back many decades. And basically growing up in Gray was kind of my version of Ray Bradbury's Greentown. There were some legends, some creepy factors. I saw actual train, I lived next to a train track in a deep ravine, and I saw actual hobos back in the day. And I thought, gosh, where'd they come from? Make up whole stories about where they came from, you know, and I would go off hunting in the woods for various and sundry things and pretend I was on some big expedition, that I was Indiana Jones, or, you know, anyway, stuff like that. So I just drew upon Gray and nature and my being a super nerd and getting into cartoons and movies of the late 70s and early 80s, mid 80s. So it's all kind of blended together in there. In Tennessee, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, and Southwest Virginia, those were the areas that I traveled to a lot and picked up a lot of urban lore and things like that. Now, in terms of the tunnel at the end, that's based on a real tunnel in the Kingsport, Tennessee area that freaks out a lot of people. The legend is that somebody was murdered inside the tunnel and you can only hear the scream, right? So of course, what everybody has to do in high school is go to the tunnel in the middle of the night and drive through it and listen for the scream. So that was like a real urban legend where I grew up, among many. And there are so many. I could fill volumes with the crazy stuff that goes on there. And, you know, with the Queen in the Mountain, Laurel, my father and I would go up to a mountain. I changed the name, you know, and he would get these plants, and I'm pretty sure he shouldn't have done it, you know, so that was a little bit of a lesson, because I have an ecology and evolutionary biology background. There was a lesson against poaching, plant poaching, which is a common thing in Appalachia, especially for ginseng, which was not what he was getting, but that is a problem for wild ginseng. So, you know, they're just, I drew from everything around me. You know, it was easy to do because it was a blank slate, and I ran with it everywhere. So I, you know, I wove a lot of them into these stories and poetry.
There's a lot of heart behind all of them, I can tell.
Yeah. And, you know, especially now that Dad and Mom are gone, things like when Dad died 3 years ago, I had to move back to Tennessee for a year. And then I kind of revisited some of these places. And it was fresher in my mind, even though some of these stories are quite old. Some of them are newer. And so I was inspired again. And then I found new inspiration while I was there as well. You know, now that my mother has recently passed, you know, I'm thinking back to the things that we explored together and the urban legends that she knew. So that's probably going to come into play with future stories to kind of help, you know, keep those fun little legends alive. And Southern Appalachia is full of them.
Do you think there'll be a Shadow Galaxy 2, like a sequel collection? Since
Well,
you seem like you still have a lot more inspiration for
yeah, I definitely think what I'm thinking, it depends on the demand for the book, because this is traditionally published, and I have to think in terms of, it's not just me, right? I'm not doing this only myself. So, but if the response to the book is good enough, then maybe we could do more collections, because I think that we could actually break out each section into its own collection. And then you would have an entirely Appalachian story. You would have an entirely horror, entirely space opera, sci-fi, entirely sea story, entire fantasy, whatever, fairy tales. So I could have a lot of fun with that. I could easily write those down. I've got a lot of short stories that I have kind of in my own personal slush pile, just kind of sitting there waiting for the right opportunity. As I think of stuff, I'll write it down, you know, and who knows, fingers crossed. And if I've heard too, that if enough copies of this sell, that we will do a hardback edition with my own illustrations. So that would be pretty great.
That would be really cool to see your own illustrations with the stories. So like fingers crossed that we can get that special hardcover.
Right, and audio too. If it gets a good enough response, then potential for audio, which I know a lot of people ask, and I really wish that we had audio for all my books, maybe one day.
And so from your poetry section of the book, one of the poems had an annotation that you had actually sent it to Ursula K. Le Guin. So I'm curious if there's a story behind that, or if she responded. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right, so in Appalachia, the poem at the back of the book, I had lived in the Pacific Northwest, and Ursula Le Guin lived there too for a while. I lived up there. And I was following, I guess I was following like her blog or something, and she put out a call like, hey, send me poetry. And so I thought, shoot, you know, I was going to send her something. And then I get a letter from her, which I published on my blog, you know, a copy of the letter after she passed away in honor of Ursula K. Le Guin. So you can go look at that. But, you know, it was just so encouraging that she really liked the poem, and, you know, said right on, as in write on, so that was a really cool little thing. And I had lost the poem for years. I couldn't find it. It wasn't saved on any computer because that was early 2000s, so 2002. And I'd moved and all this stuff. And I actually found it printed in a notebook, and then I yanked it out, finally typed it up. That's how that came to be.
Thank goodness you were able to find it again, or else we would have been missing it from this collection.
Yeah, it was pretty fun.
And so lastly, what will you be working on next? You've already hinted at quite a few projects, but I'm sure there's more.
Right. So on submission now is an epic fantasy book with dragons and a strong woman protagonist and cosmic horror monsters all blended together. So I am hopeful that a publisher will offer to buy it because I think that it has a lot of potential. It could be a series easily. And it's a lot of fun. It's got a lot of heart. And we're just waiting. We're waiting to hear back. It's been on sub a little over 2 months, and that can take time. So we'll see, but fingers crossed that's my first partnership with my agent. Now I have another book that is complete and coming out this October, The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern, October 24th from Android Press. That is a lunar punk sci-fi fantasy adventure. That's my first YA young adult novel. And that is very much leaning into kind of the Stranger Things, Goonies, Scooby Gang, mixed with a little bit of Rathacon and some lunar punk tech in the future. It's a utopia that they have built after a climate catastrophe in which they are night living. They're only socializing and out at night. It's too dangerous to be out during the day. And so they have all this really cool sort of fantasy sci-fi tech. And it's far enough in the future that some things have changed in the environment. And they uncover an evil presence from our timeline. So that's what they have to battle before they have another apocalypse on their hands. And that's not what the main character, Jen Lightworth, wants in her life. She's too busy being 14. So it's a lot of fun. That's coming. And then, of course, I'm working on the book related to the scaffold. I'm not sharing the title of it yet. It's not finished. I will be turning that into my agent next. After that, the third book in the works between me and my agent is a horror sci-fi dark comedy, lots of gore and really savage. And that one is going to be so much fun. The characters are the banter, the gore, the glamour. It's so much fun. And so I think that one seems to have got a lot of attention when I was querying, and I'm hopeful that I can make it as much fun as it could possibly be, and it's spooky and nasty too. So that one's coming later in the year. In addition to that, I'm kind of, as I said, writing on the periphery. I'm writing cozy fantasy. I'm also writing a road trip memoir because I'm kind of a road trip queen, and I've done decades of these crazy adventures that are real stories that actually happened. And so there's all kinds of things in the works. And yeah, again, paying attention to what short stories in the Shadow Galaxy resonate the most with readers. Well, so we'll see where that kind of guides us and how the sales go, whether or not Shadow Galaxy gets a sequel or at least another set of volumes breaking out all those sections, which I would love to do. And I'm always ready for new adventures. I've got a short story coming out in Interzone in April called Copper. That's my first Interzone publication. And Copper is a robot. This is in the near future, a rather cantankerous robot, and kind of honoring TikTok of Oz from L. Frank Baum's Oz books, who was like this pot-belly round copper first robot in literature, actually. So Copper comes out. You can pre-order it now, issue 295, I think it is, in Interzone, coming out in April. I also have a short high fantasy story coming out in a role-playing game anthology that I can't, for NDA reasons, can't talk about that just yet, but that's coming out in the summer. And I'm working on a new space opera short story for submission to an anthology currently, just like kind of map that out today. So there's a lot in the works, a lot more to come.
Yeah, I can't decide which one of those things you mentioned I'm more excited to hear about. I already was excited about the lantern at the Amethyst Inn.
The
I was
inn at
already
the
excited.
Amethyst Lantern. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
Well,
you.
yeah, the Amethyst Lantern itself is a lighthouse that basically it looks a lot like the Cape Hatteras light. But it's purple and white striped, and there's a special stone that looks kind of like an amethyst that provides the light. The cover is gorgeous. I can't wait to reveal it, but I can't reveal it. That's going to be revealed in Locust magazine, I believe, in June.
Ooh,
So
I am eagerly awaiting the cover.
I can't wait. The characters are so much fun. I love them. You know, I love the characters, their families. You know, it's a kind of a multi-generational tale and varied ages and very diverse cast. So it's a lot of fun. I can't wait for people to read The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern.
Everything you're saying about it's just like, that sounds amazing. I'm so excited for it to come out.
Yeah, I'm super stoked, and I'm encouraging anybody that does come to any book signings to kind of dress to theme with that lunar punk. With, you know, you can dress with amethyst or night living stuff related to like bats, owls, you know, foxes, whatever, nocturnal, mushrooms, the moths, whatever you want to dress up like, just go crazy. And tech, right? Like, so you can wearable light up tech, whatever you want to do. So I'm hoping we'll have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, that sounds like the release is going to be so fun.
Really good swag. I'm already designing it.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I love good swag. So
We've got a couple of comments of favorite characters and favorite stories. Michael said, Longshanks was my favorite character, but the library was my favorite tale. Would love to see a collection of short stories of overdue items recovered.
yeah, stories indeed.
Who else said? Oh, we have Yay Space Libraries from Gareth, which I second. It's like two of my favorite things, space and libraries.
Yeah.
And then more Roeder, says Jean-Paul.
Yeah, there's a whole, you know, there's a whole situation going on there with those robots. So
it sounds like there's quite a lot of demand for more from a lot of the stories you created for this collection.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think this is all about, you know, a future, a whole set of universes that we could have fun in and play in. It's a big sandbox, so to speak. So I'm just thrilled that the reception's so good. I'm kind of blown away. You know, I've just been reading today a couple of reviews, and I'm like, what's happening here? You know, like I really didn't expect that. I didn't know what to expect, but I'm just really super grateful, super thrilled. So thank you to everybody who's reading The Shadow Galaxy, and, you know, thank you for supporting my work and sharing my work. And you know, if you like it, let people know so that they know to discover it. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dianne, for your lovely reading and insightful answers. Thanks to everyone in the audience for participating in this event tonight. The Shadow Galaxy is out right now, and you can get yourself a copy through Space Cowboy Books online through the link listed below. And also check the chat out to see how you can find out how you can get a signed copy of this book. Dianne, any parting thoughts for us?
If you're thinking about being a writer, don't think, put that pen to paper, put those keys dancing, get it down. Don't worry about it. Just get it down and write the thing. You know who I'm talking to. Come on, write the thing. That's it. That's all there is to it, really, at the end of the day.
It's the most important advice you could give someone, yeah.
Just write the thing.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thanks so much for coming.